Well, hello everyone. My name's Nadine, and I'm a program manager with Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. I'm based here in the Upper Columbia region, calling in from New Denver. And my colleague Candace is also here this evening, and she's our program director for BC and Yukon, and she lives in Nelson. And thanks so much for coming this evening. I want to first acknowledge that in the Upper Columbia region, we are in the traditional territories of the Silks Okanagan, Secwepemc, Ktunaxa, and Sinixt peoples. And probably, as you all know, we live in some amazing mountains here where we literally have some of the best snow in the world. And what also makes this region special is that we share it with some pretty unique wild animals like mountain caribou and wolverine, which is the focus of our evening. And these Wildlife Wise workshops are being offered in partnership with POW Gals and the Alpine Club of Canada Columbia Mountains section. And Emily, I'm not sure if she is here at the moment. Emily is one of the founders of POW Gals. POW Gals aims to inform, empower, inspire, and build a community of knowledgeable backcountry enthusiasts, particularly she shredders. And they bring a variety of workshop and events to the Kootenays, focused on learning, honing skills, and having fun. And Carla Kuharek and Ben Wilkie are with us this evening from the Alpine Club of Canada Columbia Mountains section. Maybe some other members of this section are here tonight too. And this section fosters opportunities to share in the abundance of outdoor activities in Revelstoke and the surrounding communities and mountains. And they do so by organizing trips and trainings, promoting safety as environmental stewardship. And we really want to thank POW Gals and the Alpine Club of Canada, as well as Columbia Basin Trust for their financial support to make these workshops and the communications happen. And these workshops were motivated by the many inquiries that we were all getting about how to be responsible winter backcountry recreationists. So tonight we have two presentations. One's going to focus on wolverines and one will focus on caribou. We have lots of time for questions as well as some group discussion. And I want to just give off the bat a couple of Zoom tips. So if you haven't been on these online meetings before, well, congratulations. But one thing we do ask that you do, if you're comfortable, we'd love for you to keep your video on. It's nice to see people's faces. It's nice for the presenters to see your faces. But we do ask that you, for the most part, keep your audio off. Keeping yourself muted, which I see most people are doing, ensures that we don't have background noise. So thank you very much. So we're going to start with Mirjam Barrueto, who is based in Golden, and she is a wolverine researcher. And we actually also have two other wolverine researchers with us, Doris Hausleitner and Andrea Cortello, who are focused more in the southern part of the Columbia Mountains, and Mirjam's working in the northern part of the Columbias. And it's kind of interesting. Mirjam can't decide if she's a climber working as a wildlife ecologist or a wildlife ecologist who loves climbing. In her professional life, she's worked on road ecology and wildlife ecology studies in British Columbia, Alberta, as well as the Yukon and Nunavut. And she loves all things mountain: climbing, mountaineering, ski touring, cross-country skiing, trail running, and wildlife. She's working towards her PhD, and Mirjam is studying how humans impact wolverines in multi-use landscapes in Banff National Park, here in the North Columbia, as well as in the North Thompson. And if you ask Mirjam what her dream is, she'll say, a world that protects its biodiversity, runs on sustainable economies, has reversed climate change, and turned to 3-day work weeks. Sounds pretty good. So welcome, Mirjam. Thanks for being here. And over to you.
Thank you, Nadine. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. I'll just share my screen here. There we go. Yeah, thanks all for coming. I do really wish these were in-person meetings because that would make a lot of things easier. But on the other hand, maybe more people can come if we don't have to travel. Yeah, thanks for the introduction and for putting on these workshops. It's a dream for a scientist to be able to share our science. So bear with me if I get a bit too sciencey, but I'll try to make it simple. So this is where we want to go, or where I want to go with this presentation today. I want you to know how to recognize, avoid, and report reproductive ends of wolverines and why. The last one is easy, just go to our website. The other two are maybe a bit more complicated. And I'd like to start this presentation with a little bit of trip planning. So let's think you're ready for your ski tour, or if you prefer a snow machine. This is a really old snow machine we've used, and I'm really happy I don't have to work with it anymore. So you plan your trip. What do you usually do? Or most of us do. We go to a drainage that has the right aspect, so the snow will be fluffy. We think of avalanche hazard, of course. We keep an eye out for other parties above who may trigger something or just take away our poach our line. And that's where a lot of us stop. We often don't think about all the people that were here before us, maybe yesterday, the week ago, a year ago, 100 years ago, because all we see is an untracked, beautiful drainage or valley. But all these people shaped and impacted these landscapes too. And the main thing that I really want you guys to take away from this workshop is that we do share the winter landscape with a lot of animals. I found some cute photos of the little things, the mice, the grouse, the ptarmigan, mountain goats, maybe caribou, wolverines if we're lucky. And whether these are tiny or bigger wildlife, most of them have a really tough time in winter. They eat needles and lichen and frozen bones when we come out here and just recreate for fun. So I'd really like you guys to think of those animals too when you go out, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. But now I'll shift gears a little bit. Wolverines, they are amazing. That's why I study them. I think they're so cool. And here are 4 aspects about their biology that make them really stand out and special. So they're really more like grizzly bears rather than the large weasels or pine martens that they really are. And the first thing is their large home ranges. So you may have heard that they have huge home ranges to the tune of hundreds of square kilometers for females and up to a couple of thousand for males. So they need lots of space. They're also fiercely territorial. Females defend areas that contain all the resources they need to raise their kids. And the males defend territories that contain their resources, which is females. So a male will have 2 or 3 females in his territory. So that's a really big space, right? Wolverines also have very few young. That gives them very low resilience to disturbances. And they're naturally rare because of those 3 factors, which makes them vulnerable to human impacts. And why should we really care about wolverines? They are a top predator and scavenger in the landscape here. So they're important for their prey species, which are mountain goats, porcupines, marmots, caribou, and lots of other small big critters. But on top of that, they're really an important indicator species of mountain ecosystem health. They require large landscape level management because they use so much room, which forces us to think in a big scale. Unfortunately, they're impacted by climate change because they live in a very snowy, cold landscape. And they're also culturally important for Indigenous peoples throughout Canada and for non-Indigenous people. And that actually means just that we think they're cool, and that's why we care, right? They're like a really iconic species that most of us admire. They're also at risk, so legally we have a duty to protect them. And now let's talk babies. Wolverines, like grizzly bears, they give birth in midwinter, in late January to early March, but they don't hibernate. So the females will usually have 1 to 3 kids, but they only have them if they're healthy enough and have enough fat reserves. So very often they skip a year in between babies or in between litters. And because they don't hibernate, the females have to go out and get food. So their denning areas don't just have to be safe from predators because they're still quite small, right? And the babies are even smaller. They're really cute and white and fluffy, but they're vulnerable. So the females have to find a denning area that's safe, that has ungulate carrion nearby, like things that they can eat, or marmots in spring. So good denning areas are hard to find, and females may reuse them over time or once they die or move away, their daughters may take over those areas. And I'm sorry, I'm running through this a bit quickly, but we have a lot of ground to cover. So there's a little bit more background about wolverines in our area, in the Columbia region, Kootenay region. A group of us have been studying them for about a decade now. And some of the main things that we found about wolverines here is that they're really impacted by their density. Their numbers are really, or they're related to road density and to spring snow cover. So the more roads, the fewer wolverines, the more spring snow, the more wolverines. And I made some of the wolverines pink because these are the females, and females are even more have a stronger pattern like that. So females are more strongly affected by road density and spring snow cover. And overall in this area, we found that there's about 2 wolverines for every 1,000 square kilometers. And that's about 1 wolverine for every 10 grizzly bears. I think it's a good number to keep in mind, right? If you think grizzly bears are rare, wolverines are even rarer. So human disturbances and natural suitability are important for wolverines around here. And when we take those 2 results and make a map, because scientists like to make maps, so this was the study area, everything that's in outline here in black. And when we take the areas that have few roads and lots of snow, this is what you get. So the darker areas are where there's a lot of wolverines, and where we live, where most of you probably are, Revelstoke Golden, this is really wolverine territory. However, in this whole entire area, we estimated that there's only about 166 wolverines. So that's not very many, right? And this is based on science. And I'm currently trying to estimate the number of reproductive females during my PhD, but I don't have a number yet. But if I had to make an educated guess, I would think that in this area that's outlined here on the map, there'd be about 25 or 40 reproductive females. So I'm not sure exactly, but that's about the kind of range. So that's not very many, right? And if only half of them have babies every year, that means in a given year, there's only about 12 to 20 reproductive females giving birth. So that makes them really kind of special, right? That makes their den sites really special, and we have to really care for them. So here comes my science slide. I usually try to sneak in 1 science slide per talk, and this is going to take a little bit of time to develop. And I'd also like to tell you that Aaron will take a lot of these things and explain you much better what I'm meaning with those different mechanisms. So this is a conceptual model that I found in a really cool review paper recently that shows, that reviewed the impacts of recreation on a lot of different animals, a lot of birds and mammals, and they put together all the things that they could find that had been studied and made this model. And the model describes the different levels in the process of interaction between recreationists and wildlife. So I adapted the picture a little bit, and I want to walk you through here. So this would apply to all species, not just wolverines, but I'm going to talk wolverines here. So let's start here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here, but at the top, the green is the recreation, so that's us. And then these are the 4 levels of responses for wildlife. So the level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and they're sequential. So the first one has to be activated, then the second, then the third, and then the fourth. And the final outcome is changes to population size and distribution. So that's what we're usually concerned about, right? Like the species, let's say Wolverine, are impacted by recreation to the extent that their population changes. But that only happens if all those different levels get activated. So the first level is essentially that the senses have to be activated and the animal has to detect the humans. And from the right side, there's 4 different, there's blue arrows. These are modulators, and I'll talk about them in a second. The second level will be if the animal detects the human, if it changes its behavior or physiology, then potentially level 3 gets activated, which is survival, reproduction, or space use changes. And if that gets also affected, then potentially there's a population size or a distribution change. So just because an animal sees us doesn't necessarily mean there's a real lasting negative impact, or positive. It could be positive too, right? Okay, so all these 4 things have to happen for us to see a distribution change. But there's all these modulators, so the blue arrows from the right. And a modulator just means that so they can be human dependent or animal dependent. And a human dependent modulator for level 1 could be, you know, if you imagine a very stealthy hunter sneaking through the forest, chances are the animal will never even see or hear it. So if it doesn't detect us, no harm done, right? However, if we show up with our 50 friends all on our like snowmobiles and rev the engine, then the animal's very likely going to detect us. So the second modulator is behavioral and physiological changes. And that again, let's say we're 1 person versus 50 people. If it's just 1 person, it may not actually stress out the animal very much, or it may not even affect it very much, and it may lift its head and that's about it, right? But if a lot of us run towards the animal, then that could be an issue. Then the third level also gets modulated, and that's, for example, it depends the time of when the recreation takes place. If recreation takes place during reproductive season, the animal's going to be very vigilant. It's going to potentially react, and it may potentially lose its litter. Versus if the recreation happens to a time when it's not very, animals are not very vulnerable, then there may not be very much harm done. Or if the recreationist, if we interact with a young male and he falls off a cliff, that's probably not that big of a deal. It sucks for the young male, but it probably is not going to impact the population as a whole. And the same thing can be said for animals, right? Like, so there are animal dependent modulators too. It really depends, like maybe the animal is so busy with feeding that it's not listening and it doesn't see anything or anybody. That's like grizzly bears in fall. Or the animal may be very bold, or the animal may be maybe a young male, and it just doesn't matter as much whether we disturb it, like from a population level. So there's all these different modulators. So it's sometimes really hard to predict what happens with things like recreation, and it also depends on the context, time of year, the weather, like has it been a hard winter, has it been an easy winter? So there's a lot of science that goes into these things. So we're not just like making bold prediction and say everything's bad, but we really like trying to study how these things work. And again, Erin's going to give you some really good examples of these level 1, 2, 3, and 4 mechanisms for caribou, but they can also be true for other species. So for wolverines, there's been quite a bit of research and some really good studies. So the one that's most applicable to recreation was an American study, and you can find more information on their website, roundriver.org. It was from 2010 to 2016, and they looked at females and winter recreation, especially ski touring and snowmobiling. And they spent a lot of time, and I'm just summarizing this in 1 or 2 slides. So essentially what they found is that female wolverines avoided areas of their own territory that have too much dispersed winter recreation. And in other words, when there was some ski touring or some snowmobiling or some of both, they were okay. They didn't really seem to leave the area. They went on with their lives and had their babies, and it was fine. Versus when there was a lot of ski touring and a lot of snowmobiling in an area, they would not use that area during winter. So they would still be part of their territory because that's how the study was set up, but too much, they would just disappear and not use those drainages. And it didn't really matter whether it was ski touring or snowmobiling. The only difference really was that snowmobilers can usually go a bit further than ski tourists, so it's potentially a bigger area. But other than that, like that's what they found. And the disperse is important because the wolverines reacted to predictable and unpredictable things. So if the recreation was along trails or along snowmobile roads, they didn't seem to be too bothered by it, even if it was a lot of it. But when it was unpredictable, just everywhere, that really seemed to impact the wolverines. And it also mattered like the distribution of recreation and the intensity. So there were thresholds of intensity. Once there were more than a certain amount of people in an area, riders or skiers, the females stayed away. So that means I tried to kind of make this slide here. It means that if you have the same number of people if they're spread out everywhere at lower intensities, but the intensity is enough to go above a certain threshold, then there was hardly any room left for female wolverines, right? But if the same number of people all kind of piled into one drainage, then there's a lot of room for wolverines. And that's kind of interesting because very often we say that, oh, spread out, so you have a less of an impact. But if too many people do that, we can still have a pretty big impact, even though we're spread out. So for wolverines, that could be a bit counterproductive. And that's just something to keep in mind, right? Especially there's some areas in where we live, like things like Rogers Pass, things like Quartz Creek or Boulder Mountain, that there's a lot of people there, but they're in one area, right? But if we all spill over into every single drainage, that will potentially make a much bigger impact for wolverines. Okay, so I gotta go a bit quicker here. So what can you do? So avoiding reproductive dens would be a really good thing to do. There's a lot of other things you can do, but this is the main thing, right? That I really wanna give to you. As you remember, there's not going to be very many reproductive dens on the landscape in any given winter, so chances are low that you're actually finding one, unless you go explore in quiet drainages. And the reason why you might come onto one is because wolverines and us, we select for the same things. So their dens are often on north-facing slopes, and that's where the female like to have their dens, and that's also where we kind of want to go and in our spare time. And so this is an actual den site. You see here the red cross. It's at the bottom of a little boulder field in the subalpine below tree line. Same as this one is a location, the approximate location of a den site. Big boulder field, avalanche paths, close to tree line in a pretty remote area where nobody ever goes. And same here, right? But you could exactly see, like, this would be a pretty neat drainage to go and ski. So that's kind of where we can come in conflict because they're super sensitive and they don't really like it if people show up, whether it's scientists or skiers. So staying away would be a very good thing to do. And what does a wolverine then look like? So at the top left here, that's essentially what it is. Literally, it's usually a hole in the snow with a lot of wolverine tracks. This one's actually just an overnight den, but you kind of get the picture, right? Like a lot of wolverine tracks, concentrations, a hole in the snow, and the tracks going into there. And the hole's usually not very big because the wolverine's not that big. So you think something that's about, I don't know, about a foot wide or something like that, like foot or two. If it's much bigger, it might be a bear den. So one thing to also keep in mind is that wolverines make food caches too. So the bottom right, that is a food cache in a Gorman drainage, Gorman Lake drainage here outside of Golden. So the den areas are kept pretty tidy by the female. So usually you're not going to see a lot of food or food bits remaining surrounding in the snow. If you see that, it's more likely a food cache. And here's, I do a couple seconds of a quick video that Andrea sent to me. This is like what one of those big boulder field looks like in summer. There was a den underneath here in winter, and they went and investigated it in summer once they left. So you see really big boulder fields in the subalpine. And the tracks are the other thing. I could talk forever about how wolverine tracks look. Many of you may have come across them. They're usually pretty distinct. So they do have 5 toes. And so that's a bit different from dogs and cats. But the main thing is the pattern. There's a very characteristic 3x3 pattern that goes in a straight line, usually straight up a slope, straight up a valley. On the left side, top left, there's also, you see the 3x3 pattern. 3 and 3 and 3. This is when they go slowly. And this is the other pattern they do, the 2x2 pattern. This is when they go a bit faster. And this looks more like a marten pattern, but it's much, much bigger because a marten track is about this big, like if you make a round with your fingers. And a wolverine foot is about a palm, like the palm of a hand. That's about how big their feet are. So it's really quite different. And once you see a wolverine track, you know that everything else was only marten tracks. So that's a thing, like a concentration of tracks surrounding a hole that really means it could be a wolverine then. So what do you do if you see one? Well, essentially, stay away and take some photos and leave the drainage, because they do react to people showing up, unfortunately. But most likely you're going to be so far out that it won't be hard to go somewhere else to go the next drainage over. But also we would really like to get you to report all your wolverine sightings here on our website, wolverinewatch.org. There's some more information on the website. And if it's a wolverine, then we may, Andrea or Doris, my colleagues, they may be able to go and check on it with a drone. And we just collect all that information to learn more. We don't close the area or anything, right? We're scientists, we're not land managers, but this is really how you can help. You can report any wolverine sightings, tracks, animal, den sites. And you may see some of these posters out, because we're really lucky that Y2Y and all these other groups are helping us get the word out. Because again, we're scientists, we're not an organization, so we do need help with marketing, so to speak. And yeah, let's open it for questions.
Great, thank you. But now I'd like to introduce Erin Reid. We'll shift gears a little bit to perhaps a less vicious animal, but equally as mysterious and interesting and rare to see on the landscape, mountain caribou. So Erin Reid was born and raised in the West Kootenay. He studied at Selkirk College in the Recreation Fish and Wildlife program, and then he completed his degree in wildlife management at UNBC. And Erin has spent many years as a student biologist in the Columbia Basin with the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. And he began working with the province of BC as a wildlife biologist in 2008. And he has studied sheep, goats, cougar, bear, horned animals, canines, and fur bearers, a whole bunch of different wildlife, has a lot of expertise. And Erin started with the Caribou program as the Kootenay biologist in 2017. So welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Nadine. Can everyone hear me well? Yeah, I got a few nods there. That's good. All right, I'm just gonna shift over to the share screen here. All right, can everyone see that? Yeah.
We can see it, but you're not in slideshow mode.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do that right now. All
there
right.
You go.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, so yeah, mountain caribou. I doubt there's anyone in the Revelstoke area who is not familiar with mountain caribou. It's you are the epicenter of caribou and all of the wonderful, challenging conflicts that surround them. And whether you're in the forest industry or the ski guiding industry or anything, you're touched by caribou if you live in Revelstoke. So I'm going to assume a certain amount of knowledge, but I am going to move fairly quickly through the Caribou 101 because some people just don't know much about them. So and there's some key things you need to know in order to understand why there's a why there are problems. So a quick, I'll touch on some status and threats. And then we'll dig right into the winter months and why winter is important to caribou disturbance, and some of the tools that say government uses to protect them, and then of course what can you do as users. I will say that before I go into this though, that Revelstoke is kind of a special place for caribou, mountain caribou in BC, because it has decades of research and management that have gone. Revelstoke area is so far ahead of most places in BC with caribou management. Many of the tools that we use were first used in Revelstoke and understood in Revelstoke. Everything from surveying techniques to maternal penning, moose reductions. I'll touch on these a little bit later, but a lot of it was born in Revelstoke because you have so many really amazing biologists up there that care about this and have spent careers working on it. So yeah, it's a pretty caribou rich place in the world that you live in. All right, so when I say caribou in BC, woodland caribou are the caribou. There's no other kinds of caribou. They're all woodland caribou. They're differentiated by behavior, or so there's different ecotypes. All these polygons you see on the map are where caribou occur in BC, the green, the red, and the purple, but we want to talk about the mountain caribou. That's the purple in the south. So deep snow caribou, mountain caribou, they are federally designated as threatened, and they're on the Species at Risk Act, and then provincially they're red listed species. So that comes into play with caribou management. They are, this red here is pretty much the mountain caribou, like a current, like in the last 2 decades of where mountain caribou could be found in the wet belt. So the interior rainforest, that's their zone. Historically, they lived all the way from the Okanagan Highlands right over to the Rocky Mountains and as far south as central Idaho and Montana. So there's been significant range contractions and population declines in the last 100 years. Well, more recent than that, 50, 60 years. But they're behaviorally different from the other caribou in BC because they go up in the winter and they spend their winter at high elevations, and they stand on top of the snowpack and they pretty much eat arboreal lichen or tree lichen because that's really all there is. So yeah, they're in the deer family. They're medium size, about a meter, just over a meter at their shoulder in height. Their weight, maybe 110 for a light cow, up to about 210 kilograms for a heavy bull. For perspective, say moose would be, 3-4 times that weight for a bull moose. So they are fairly lightweight compared to some of the other ungulates. Nice dark chocolate brown coats with creamy manes. They're lovely looking ungulates. Both males and females have antlers. That's one thing that's kind of special about them. But these feet are really what give them the ability to do what they do. They got massive hooves. These dew claws in the back, they spread out really wide, and they really do make a great snowshoe, and then allows them to stand up on top of the snow. So every herd has a different story and a different set of challenges, and there's no silver bullet to why caribou are in trouble. It's very complex, and there's always multiple factors playing roles in these declines. But to summarize it succinctly, there's really 3 categories. There's increased predation, habitat loss and fragmentation, and winter disturbance. The increased predation and the habitat loss and fragmentation are related in that when you remove trees, whether it be from logging, fires, oil and gas, power lines, in a rainforest, you create a lot of food, right? A lot of herbs and shrubs that deer, moose, and elk like. And we have changed the landscape so much in the interior rainforest in the past 40, 50 years that these other species, deer, elk, and moose, are now here in way higher densities than they would have been historically. Some of them, elk and white-tailed deer, didn't even exist here. In fact, moose were incredibly rare and really low densities in southern BC, even 100 years ago. So we've changed the landscape, we've changed things, and with these new ungulates, we call them primary prey, comes their predators. So higher densities of wolves and cougars in the south. And because there's more predators here now, because of the changed landscape, there's more encounters with mountain caribou in the summer months primarily, but there's more encounters, which leads to unsustainable mortality of adults, females, and essentially your populations go down. So it's directly linked to the way what we've done to our habitat. The third bullet here is the winter disturbance part, which is basically what we're going to focus on for the rest of this little chat here. Now, in the Kootenays, which is the southern part of this map, there's only 2 herds left, the Central Selkirks and the Columbia North. There's another 7 or so have become extirpated or functionally extirpated, meaning they're not viable anymore. There's 1 or 2 animals or no animals left, and that's all in the last 20 years. So the red that you see on this map are those extirpated herds, and the maroon or wine is where we have caribou left. And those green circles, the one in the south is the Central Selkirks, and the one in the north here is the Revelstoke complex. Actually, it includes some of the areas on the groundhog area here as well. But yeah, so we'll be focusing on this top area here today. I got to throw a couple graphs in here just for people to understand why caribou, like the caribou story. Now, if you look at this bottom graph, this is the Central Selkirks, and you can see the declines over the past 20 years are significant, 85% declines. So right down into the through the late 90s, early 2000s, most of the mountain caribou populations experienced dramatic declines, which can be attributed primarily to that predation problem. And that is, you know, that we have a lot of collar data and research that has pointed to that. Now, in this herd in the south here, the Central Selkirks, there is 26 animals left. And so that's good news. That gives us animals to work with. And in the north, the Columbia North up on top, you can see that that dashed line right around 2003, 2004 is where biologists implemented a moose reduction program where we brought moose from 1,600 down to 350 animals. And that was through hunting, right? So that was an attempt to reduce wolf densities, and it worked. It stabilized the population. And then in more recent years, maternal penning, another tool that we use to recover caribou, and predator control has been implemented, and now we're seeing growth. So we've had 3 consecutive years of growth in this population, and it looks like things are turning around. So that's a good news story. All right, so winter. Caribou, really, these mountain caribou, they eat the lichens in the trees. That's all they have available. They're standing on 2 to 4 meters of snow in places. So that's it. That's the only option. And really, the problem is that arboreal lichen kind of sucks. It only has 3% crude protein, which is kind of that's what all ungulates are looking for when they're eating plant material in the winter, and that's quite low. It's low enough that they're on a negative energy budget all winter long. As soon as they start eating it, they're losing body mass and condition all through winter. And the cows have a double whammy because they're trying to grow a fetus. They're going through gestation, right? So they don't have much energy to play with. They depend on all the fat reserves that they can gain through summer, spring, summer, and fall. Columbia North, this is an elevational graph that shows you at what elevations during what time of the year caribou are. Now this is important. The take-home message here is that caribou are up high, so 15 meters and 1,500 meters and above, all the way up to, you know, we surveyed it for caribou at 2,000 meters in helicopters in March. So all winter long until the end of April, they start coming back down to take advantage of green up, and then they go right back up to calve in the spring around the end of May. And then they spend their in the alpine, subalpine again all summer long, and then they dip back down just before winter sets in. They they don't want to walk around in crappy snow up high, so they wait till it snows and then they go back up. We do movement analysis on caribous. We know that they don't move a lot in the winter. This is a graph that shows you the movement rates. It's called step length frequencies, and basically all these bars here on the left side of the graph, you can see that the bulk of movement that caribou make throughout the winter months is under 500 meters. From say 12 o'clock noon on one day to the next, almost all the movements are under 500 meters. There's a few larger movements for sure, but you know, not very many animals are not very many times do they move like 2 kilometers in a 24-hour period. They do that because they don't have the energy to actually, they can't afford to move very much. So they just mill around, and they eat lichen and they try and conserve energy. So here is a typical caribou winter scene. Many of you have seen this, I know, either from the air during work or out ski touring or on a sled. And it's a great picture because it shows fresh caribou beds, nice big deep big tracks that an ungulate would lay down in the winter, and then plus old sign, right? The old beds there and the divots in the snow. I like this picture because it does give an example. It kind of trains your eye to what you should be looking for. But and then I use this slide as kind of a segue to, like, this was a nice peaceful place for caribou until in the recent decades, because we figured it out that it's also a great place to be, right? So it's high enough elevation that the snow is always good, and it's got the adjacent steep slopes that we all like to ski and play in. So I don't know how old the heli ski industry is, or ski touring, but I'm guessing plus 30 years plus maybe. We've been using these areas, and of course we're coming into contact and having encounters with caribou more and more often. And here's a good example of some ski tracks, and the caribou are bedded right in them. And then of course, the snow machines, the mountain machine in the late 90s, early 2000 started taking off, and it's gone bananas, really. Like it's absolutely, no one knows this more than the people in Revelstoke. You live with it every day of the winter. It's incredible how the growth of that sector and industry. So you can see some caribou here in the middle of the screen and their tracks milling around. But then of course, a couple of riders probably did this in a matter of an hour, right? Hour and a half of playing around. So they're after the exact same places. The sledding and caribou the conflict is so it's so obvious when you're flying and looking at this. So why does it matter? Well, Mirjam spoke a lot about disturbance, which is great because I don't really have to do that much. But the way I kind of like to explain it to people is there really is 2 different types. There's a behavioral response to being disturbed, which is the stuff we all get, right? It's pretty intuitive. It causes you ride into a drainage, or you skid into a drainage with a group of people, and if there happens to be caribou there, they're gonna move, and they become more vigilant. They stop foraging as much, and they're on edge, right? So they're using more energy, and potentially displacing them, or they have to go to a place that they'd rather not be. The best literature for that would be Sight et al. 2007. You can look that up. The physiological side of things is a little bit, this one's more difficult to explain to people. It's kind of the invisible one. And we all have the stress response in us, the acute stress of fight or flight. Everyone is aware of that. It serves a purpose. It allows us to immediately mobilize energy reserves to get us out of there, right? There's a problem, we need to go right now. And it has a purpose. But the problem with wildlife, not just caribou, all wildlife, if it becomes chronic, that's when you start seeing problems. So, and chronic meaning, if one event, the stress levels spike and they can stay high for hours to days. So if you're doing that over and over and over and over throughout a winter, there's a whole list of things that can go wrong here. Prolonged or repeated response can decrease caribou's fitness. That's the problem, right? So it can lead to suppression of appetite, poor body condition, hypertension, decreased disease resistance, and then the last one there, reduced reproductive output. And that's a problem for caribou because they don't have a really high reproductive capacity anyway. Calf survival is very low. They get pregnant all right and they calve okay, but those calves they don't survive very well in that first month of life, probably because they're not in good enough body condition to give birth to a heavy, healthy calf. ski touring is a part of the problem. I mean, a lot of people think that it's quieter. It's way less. You know, it's you don't cover as much ground as say being flown around in helicopters or on sleds. But it is an issue. We've seen especially in say Stag Leap, where you have that really intense use on the Selma Crescent Pass. The Caribou stopped using that area once it really took off. They used to use it all the time, but it became so popular that they stopped using it. And we've seen it, but it's really hard to show in research and literature. Probably because there's hardly any controls left in the province. There's nowhere that people aren't. And to set up a real good study to pinpoint a problem is very difficult nowadays. There's the ski touring thing is a little different because I think wildlife, if they can't, like if snowmobiles are zipping along a groomed trail, they can become habituated to that and they know that activity and they're not as startled by it. But if, say, a ski touring skin track is not always in the same place, so it's not predictable and it can cause an even a more of a negative response. And the immediate flight distance may be greater or for longer, right? But it really depends on those caribou and how much exposure to humans they've had. And one of the things I kind of like to point out too is that displacement can occur to a suboptimal habitat. That's one of the problems, right? They're in an area that they'd rather not be. But if that's not the case, we may just be making good areas have higher densities of caribou or other wildlife. It'd be the same for any wildlife, but that's not good either because now there's more competition among individuals. So there's a whole host of problems that can arise when we interrupt their activity. One of our tools is snowmobile closures. This is the red on the map here. These are done under the Wildlife Act. It's a very powerful tool, and we use them quite often in the province. Revelstoke has a lot of them. Everyone's familiar with them. And more recently, last year, we put a large one in Central Selkirks. But this is kind of the main tool. It does affect ski tours and of course, people who just are on sleds. So if you want access to these maps, there's plenty of resources online. Best way to get them is just Google BC snowmobile closures, and you can find all sorts of maps that you can upload. And you can see all that red there is north of Revelstoke. And in the late 2000s that they were implemented. And so the majority of sledding is in the south, closer to town. But yes, significant areas were closed for caribou. This one is a little different in the Nakusp area, where we use collars to track the caribou throughout the winter, and then the zones close and open around where the caribou are. I can give you more information on that at another time, or you can go to that to snowmobileselkirks.ca and read about it yourself. This only works in the context of the Central Selkirks because we have a really high proportion of cows collared in that population. So we know, we're very confident that our protections are actually protecting the animals that remain in this population. So you know, what can you do? That's why we're all kind of here. I think like one of the best things that people can do is just become informed, right? Understand the issues. The more you know, the more that you're able to make those good choices while you're out there. And just talking to your peers and the people that you recreate with, share your knowledge. These are the kind of things that I think that really go a long way. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and it makes the issue of caribou conservation difficult to understand. So it's things like this, these types of presentations that I think go a long way. And the little poster here, you'll probably see more of these in the coming months while you're out. And everything makes sense. It's good to follow those points. But I'll stop talking and turn it over to Nadine again.